I am Emil Kressel. I'm going to walk you through this brief video that will talk about some tips and tricks and tools for productivity and maintaining your focus and concentration, getting engaged with your work in progress. This is actually the second in a pair of videos. The first video walks you through a big diagram on the productive thinking process, and I recommend that you see that one first because it helps you understand where and when and how you actually apply these tools, and really any kind of productivity or focus tools you might come across. You really have to understand where in your thinking process and your thought process that you can actually apply those tools. If you don't understand that, it's pretty difficult to actually apply any kind of tips or tricks that have to do with productivity. So this is broken up into a few different sections, 3 different sections, in fact. First one is to how to prioritize your work. The second one is organizing your work. And third, making deliberate, conscious decisions. And in each one of these different categories, there are 3 separate examples of tools that you can use. It's hardly exhaustive. They're just to help you understand the concept. There are a lot of other tools out there for productivity, but this will help you sort of categorize just the idea. You have to be able to prioritize your work, and you have to be able to organize your workflow, and it's really important that you are conscious of the decision-making process. So when we look at the prioritization process, fundamental to this is knowing how to identify your work in process and knowing that there's a difference between your work that you're actively working on and the work that's pending. And this is really important to understand, because what happens if you don't, as you see these long lists of 25, 50, 100 things that you have to do. And what can often happen is when you see that many things on the to-do list, it's just debilitating. You end up not doing anything. Or there's so many different things you're trying to do at once that you're multitasking, you're changing gears so often that you're really not being productive, you're not being fair to yourself or the people who you're trying to help. So here are some tools that can help you make that distinction of work in progress, but also help you prioritize the work that you have to do so that you can identify the work that you should focus on. This is a pretty common one. This is called the Eisenhower method. You may have seen it in a different incarnation with Covey's quadrants. The idea is that you have 2 different dimensions. You're looking at how urgent it is versus how important it is, and you'll understand this really fundamental thing that has to do with just because it's urgent doesn't mean that it's important. Some people might be imposing their sense of urgency on it, or you might be looking at it and thinking that just because it's urgent, it must be important. But you should really look at the work that's at hand and make a determination of whether or not it really is important or not, just because it's urgent. The escape has to do with the kind of work that we do that's not important or urgent, yet somehow we end up doing it. Often that happens because we're spending so much time in that first quadrant of important and urgent, and we're constantly in crisis mode. We're constantly putting out fires in it, and that can be really exciting and it can be very productive, and I like being in that environment, but it's not sustainable. It's not something you can do for a long term, because you start to get burnt out and you start making mistakes. And so then to escape, you start doing stuff that's really not that important, and it's not having that big of an impact on what you do or who you serve. The big distinction I wanted to make, though, for purposes of this video, is the difference between the first 2 quadrants here, the crisis and strategic. If you don't make the distinction of looking at your work and saying, this is critical work, this is work that's in crisis, and this is strategic work, you're never going to really get around to that strategic work. And that's a real problem, because then you're never really going to move forward in any sort of meaningful way. You have to be able to identify your strategic work, because if you don't, the crisis stuff is always going to take precedent. And we're going to look at a tool that's going to help you actually stay on top of the strategic work, so that you don't end up just always constantly putting out fires, instead of finding out what's causing those fires and taking care of that, that's what the strategic work is. Other tool we're looking at here is the effort impact matrix. Really simple 2x2. You're looking at how impactful the work or the task that you have to do is, and how much effort you have to put into it. Obviously, the sweet spot here is going to be something that doesn't require a lot of effort, but it's also going to have a big impact. That's your low-hanging fruit, right? And this is really relative. So if you have a slew of things that you're looking at, figuring out what to do, what should I do first, this is going to be a nice thing you can pull out on a whiteboard, or you can do it on a white piece of paper, and you just look at all your work relatively across these two dimensions and identify those things that this isn't going to require a whole lot of effort on me, but on my part, but it's going to have a big impact on what I do or who I serve. And that's a good way to figure out something that this is what I'm going to start focusing on for the day or the afternoon or the morning. And so I can get some traction and really get going. Similarly, is this diagram here. It looks at, it's called the value feasibility prioritization chart, and you may have seen it in terms of the customer value versus feasibility. It's one that's sometimes used in tech world, IT world, or DevOps. And this is much more of a macro level, because on a micro level, you're going to have to define, well, what does value mean? And even more complicated, what does feasibility mean? And there are a lot of moving parts, though, in that way. But on a macro level, this can be just a quick win to say, well, how easy is this going to be to actually implement? How much value is it going to bring to a customer or to myself or to my boss, my organization? And then again, sort of relatively speaking, you put your post-it notes or write the task down and figure out where the feasibility is going to be high and the value is going to be high. And that's where you're going to want to start, right? Because that's going to give you the most traction, biggest bang for your buck. So those are some good things to look at. I will say that when you're putting together your to-do list like this in any way, you have to make sure that they actually are to-dos. You don't want to put a project in there and try and make that determination, because if you have a project like you're rerouting a city street somewhere, that's a lot of different tasks and a lot of different deliverables, right? And you have to make sure that when you're looking at a to-do list, you don't put your projects in there. You're just looking at actionable items. So you have to make sure it's sort of usually, if you can put it in a verb noun construction, a simple way to sort of determine if that is an actionable item: walk the dog, clean my office, do my laundry, finalize a report. That's the sort of individual actionable item that you want to have on any of those different prioritization lists. Okay, moving on to organizing your workflow. This is really important. Write it out. Basic understanding, to externalize your memory, is something we talked about in that first video that I recommend you see. Externalize your memory. You got to write it out. So you're trying to store all the things that you have to do in your life, at work, at home, at school, volunteer work you might do, all that stuff stored in your head. It's not fair to you. It's not fair to who you're trying to help. You're not getting the kind of impact that you should have, because all that stuff is swirling around in your head. And so these are some tools that can help you get it out of your head and organize it in a way that can really keep you moving forward effectively. This is a simplified Kanban. You'll see it's only 3 different columns: pending, doing, and done. And you'll see that the middle column is much narrower than the others. That's by design. You want to have very few items in that middle column, 3 to 5 things, and that might be hard for some people to actually come to terms with, because they have so many different things they're trying to do at once. But that's how you focus. At any one time, you really want to minimize it, and 3 to 5 things is a good kind of rule of thumb to think about. For this morning, this afternoon, this day, I'm focusing on these 3 to 5 things, these to-dos that I have to do. Yes, I have a whole bunch of other things in pending that I have to do, but I'm not thinking about those. And your workspace should reflect that as well. You don't want to have 100 of different things that you have to do sprawled out all over your cubicle or your office, your workspace, because then it's just unwieldy. It's hard to get traction because you feel like you're doing so many different things at once. But if you're focusing on just that 3 to 5 things you have to do in front of you, and put everything else away so it's sort of out of sight, and then you bring it in only when you're actually actively working on it. The done is certainly a nice thing to have because you can make this physical realization of the work that you have to do at the end of the day or week. You have a stack of cards or post-its that you look through, and for yourself or for your boss or your team, you can say, look how much we've done. And that's a great way to see the kind of progress you're making on your to-do lists. So this is a great way of doing it. You can do it as an analog, like on a whiteboard or a board with post-its and cards, or you can do it digitally. Kanban flow is a good one. Nice thing about the digital is that you can do it anywhere. You can be on a subway and pull out your phone and go through your Kanban board. And it's a great way of sharing with your team as well, so you don't have a physical space to do it. But there's something nice about the tactile nature of cards as well, so that's just something to explore. The other thing about Kanban boards is that you can make them a little bit more complex if you wanted to. You can have swim lanes and rows, and every row is a teammate, or every row is a category of the kind of work that you do, or the category of your life. So again, like school, work, volunteer work. And that can be a good way to organize it. You can color code the post-its or the cards with stickers or the color of the post-its according to your teammates or prioritization or again category of your work. And there's so many different dimensions that you can get into to help organize your work. So a Kanban can be a handy way to really externalize all that stuff you're trying to organize in your head and get it out in the physical world. Another pretty simple way, you may be doing this already, it's kind of a simple to-do list, but you make it agile throughout the day, throughout the week. And I call it an agile to-do list. The idea is you write down, just focusing on these are the 3 to 5 things that I'm going to do for today, hell or high water. And then, inevitably stuff gets in your way, family obligations, other things to do with your household, whatever it might be. And when you don't accomplish those things that you really wanted to get done, you carry them over to a new list, or you could have just a rolling list, but just make a clean slate and put it on a new list. And then you add a couple more things for the next day so that when you do come in the morning, you have that to-do list ready to go for what you're going to focus on for that day. And you're sort of agile. You keep moving forward, making some progress, and again, creating a record of the things that you have accomplished with those to-do lists as well. Pretty simple. This is the last one, calendaring. There are people who feel really strongly about having everything you have to do on your calendar, and that's the way you manage your workload. I would caution you, not all work should be managed that way or can be really managed effectively that way. I think there are probably some jobs where that makes sense, but I think it's fair to say maybe not all jobs, and maybe even most jobs can't be really managed that way. One of the reasons why is you create this. You have to collaborate with people, and if your calendar is really clogged with everything that you have to do, it might be hard to collaborate. It might be difficult for people to get a hold of you and get time on your calendar, and it also might be daunting to see everything organized on your calendar if you're very busy and you have a lot of different things to do. And it doesn't really prioritize that way. It starts to get that confusion. Remember that urgent and important, how we need to be careful about not conflating this idea of urgency with importance. Those are two different things. And if you have everything that you do on a timeline, then you're looking at urgency, and it starts to confuse that concept. What I will say, however, is that other part of strategic work, the important but not urgent, it is a good idea to put those items on a calendar, because then if you dedicate the time and define the time on your calendar, it's more likely to get done, because as I mentioned, the crisis stuff, the important and urgent stuff, that's always going to take precedent if you don't define your strategic work. And especially helpful is if you put that strategic work on a calendar, so you have a specific date where you're going to actually do that strategic work. So that's where I think calendaring your to-do list can be very helpful. Okay, moving on to the next part, which is organizing your workflow. Making conscious decisions and deliberate decisions. And this is important because we often don't realize that we're making decisions or that we need to make decisions. And you need to be aware of that as a process. If you're not, it's always sort of needling in the back of your head, and you're not being productive because you're hemming and hawing, and you feel like it's hard to get traction on your work because you haven't made the deliberate decision that you need to make. So are a few different tools that can help you really articulate that decision-making process so that you can move forward more effectively. Risk analysis matrix, this is going to be familiar to the project managers out there, and the idea is to think about, well, what's the probability of this risk actually happening, and what is the impact going to be? So if you are somebody who, you always think of all the different things that could happen, all the risks involved in some project or a task, and that can be so daunting and it's hard for you to move forward, or somebody on your team is like that. The truth is, having those people or having that attitude can be really helpful, because it's good to see all the angles and think through all those angles. But you have to be able to measure them and say, well, yeah, it's true we have this event, and yeah, if you're worried about an asteroid coming and pummeling the building, that would have a big impact on this event. But what's the probability? It's pretty low, 0, maybe 1. And so we're still in the yellow zone. So let's move past it and focus on the risks that we should be concerned about. Like if it's an outdoor event and it's in September or November in Portland, rain's going to be a big one. It would have a pretty big impact, and it's a good probability. So let's try and mitigate. Either get a tent or move it indoors. So those are the kind of things that helps you make the decision to move forward, rather than just constantly trying to juggle all these possibilities of risks, so you can move forward and actually get to work on what you need to get to work on. This one's a little bit more complicated, but once you've done it a couple times, it's really a nice tool for decision making. This is weighted scoring, or a decision making matrix. The idea here, here's a scenario. You're looking at deciding on which learning management system to use, and you say, okay, first step here is define your criteria, your decision-making criteria. You say, well, in this case, it's this first column here on this chart, and the criteria needs the quality. We need to determine the quality, determine cost, how easy it is to use, what kind of technical support it has, and then for each one of those criteria, you're going to give it a weight. In this case, 1 to 5. And you have that weight, and then you look at the different products. And so for this product Pixel, what score, what rate do you give it for quality? 5. What rate do you give it for the criteria of cost? You go all the way through, and then you say, okay, you take the weight times the rating, and then you get the value. And you do that for all the different ratings and weights, and then you add them up. And then, so in this case, the product of Western Night wins out with 29. This is another way of doing it. This is actually a true weighting, where you actually have all the different weights need to add up to 100. So you have 35%, 30%. Same idea. You define your criteria, but this sort of forces your decision making to give it a more of a relative score. So really kind of giving them weight against one another, and that can give you a little, not really objective, because all of this is pretty subjective, but it helps you through that decision-making process to be more deliberate. Same idea, though in this case you're deciding on what neighborhood to move to. And so you're going to take the weight times the score times the rate, weight times the weight, add them all up, and again in this scenario it's neighborhood B. But one of the things that can happen in this process is that you go through this whole process and you think, it's still not sitting right with me. And that's okay too, because it can help you sort of reevaluate either the weight of your criteria or your criteria altogether. So it still is deliberate, forcing you to go through that deliberate decision-making process. And that can be, again, a good way of working through it so you can make that decision and move forward and get to the work that you need to get to doing and be engaged with that work. This is a website you can go to that actually walks you through that weighted scoring process. You just write out your criteria, write out the weights, write out the rates, and does all the math for you. raisonliving.github.io/CISO, and that link will be included in the description of this course as well. Okay, last one. This is the force field analysis. It's sort of a fancy pros and cons list, and this is a scenario that you're trying to decide whether or not you should implement a learning development program. The answer is always yes. Spoiler alert. But so we look at the forces of change for positive. Yes, it's going to raise company attractiveness. It's going to boost efficiency, increase job satisfaction, all those great things. And then, well, the reasons not to, forces against it. It might cost some money, takes a lot of time. It's going to make people think more, which I'll tell you right now, that's not a bad thing. The reason it's a little bit more fancy is because you have scores there. So again, you're giving them rates. How big of an impact, how important are each one of those forces? And you give them each scores, and then you all add them up. And as we know well, and implement a learning development system. It's the right thing to do. So it's a pretty simple tool, just adding a little bit of quantitative scoring to your process. So that is it. Those are the concepts. I hope it helps. As I mentioned, you need to know how and when to apply these tools. So you need to know about the central executive mode and externalizing your memory, and when you spin down, and all that stuff is included in the first part of this pair of videos. It talks about productive thinking. But I hope that you can use these tools right away, give them a try, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen. Thanks.